All right, Dylan, to kick us off, will you talk a little bit about the first steps to take when working on a startup idea? Do we get to just jump in and start writing code or do something else?
Yeah, the first place I always start is to always de-risk the idea. So I want to get rid of that risk. And what that usually means for me in practice is researching the competition. And I think this is a problem that a lot of founders have, is just because we have an idea, we then start to think that my idea is so strong that other people may not, other people may not have, as great of an idea as mine, or there's just something unique because I'm coming up with it. But I can guarantee you 100% of the time, somebody is already working on your idea. When the Wright brothers were trying to fly a plane, somebody else was trying to fly a plane. It's happening. And so you have to accept that, and you have to go out and research, look on the internet and try to find somebody else who is doing exactly your idea. And so that's the first place. And then I think, as you're doing that exercise, I expect you to get really demotivated and start to feel like, oh my gosh, this is a long road ahead. Maybe this company already has funding, or maybe, their team looks so strong, or their product looks so stylish. And what you're doing in this exercise is you're going to see somebody else who's had a lot of progress, but you're also going to start to hone in on, what do I think that they're doing wrong? They may have money, they may have, a stylish website, but they might not have, this core functionality, or it seems too costly for what I would like to get out of my service. And so you're really starting to hone in on, when you look at the competition, you're like, well, if I have to do something and I can't build, I can't build Google in day one, well, I have to focus on something really, and then build towards that. And so honestly, always start with just looking into the competition. And you can also learn about not only their tech, but also their business model, learn about how they're being spoken about in the press, and also from their customers. And then that just helps you, one, understand the market, understand the product, but then also understand the business case. And so don't try to reinvent the wheel, just go out and look. And I have been in development meetings with founders where I've actually told them about competitors that they didn't know about. And I'm never going to work with somebody where I feel like they haven't researched the competition, because when I'm looking to partner with an early stage founder, if they don't know the competition, it's just a really bad sign.
Yeah, I think those are all really critical pieces of advice. In addition to researching the competition, I think customer discovery is a really important activity for early stage de-risking of ideas, to actually go out, talk to people, learn about their world, and not really focusing on what they think of your idea, but learning about their world. I'll post a link to a really great ebook in the chat here, but Dylan, do you have any favorite techniques for customer discovery? One connection between these 2 points too, I think, is that oftentimes the competition is the status quo. So if you're trying to sell me a widget or a water bottle and I just don't care, and that's just not important to me, that's a form of competition as well.
Yeah, I think just to your point, Steph, I'm just very much of a person of just go and meet people and talk to them, and don't turn it into a big thing. There's ways to do interviews, ethnographic interviews, and I think, Steph, you're going to have a better knowledge of that, just given that, that's one thing that Polsky is really strong in, is just, coaching people and getting them into those customer interviews. From an entrepreneur standpoint, I just, tell people don't be scared, and just go out and speak to people. Even if you're the most introvert of introverts, you just have to remember that people like talking about, something that they're passionate about, or something that's painful to them. And so in a lot of ways, just by you going through that experience, you're validating their experience as a human. And so it's, we make these terms like customer discovery, and the reason is that we want to codify that and help you understand. But from an entrepreneur standpoint, just know that, at the end of the day, it's you, engaging with somebody else, and it should actually be pretty fun. You get to learn what they're passionate about, or what their pains are, and that starts to sort of create the power of the entrepreneurial spirit that'll, ultimately get you to build a really good product.
I think that's great. Yeah. And I think maybe could you talk a little bit about how doing that customer discovery and early research helps teach an entrepreneur what are the first things that they should build when they're starting to build a product, and how can they sort of make those decisions in other ways than talking to customers?
Sure. You know, when we think about tech, like the thing we have to remember is that, like, especially software, like you're trying to repeat a process over and over again. And so when we're at the very beginning of our startup journey, like we're trying to figure out what process do we even want to repeat. And so the whole customer discovery process is actually about figuring out like, okay, what am I trying to repeat? Like, what is the thing that I want to make more efficient? You may come into that customer discovery meeting, you know, with this hypothesis of, you know, people just really hate their calendaring app, and, you know, I know that they would want to do it X way. But then you know, may see that, hey, this person is actually emailing things to themselves, and that I believe, you know, and they're using that as sort of a way into their calendar. You just might start to discover things that you didn't appreciate, you know, at first, you know, just in conceiving of your own idea. And so really, when I think about customer discovery or trying to build the right thing, like the goal is like, from a technology point of view, is what am I trying to repeat, or what am I trying to make more efficient for this person where I see them doing it now? And so, you know, sometimes we think about technology as like a whole new thing, right? Like blockchain is a whole new thing, but often blockchain is codifying systems that have been in place, you know, since English law, right? It's just a way to do it in a more technologically advanced way. And so we don't want to lose sight of, just because we might want to use machine learning, or we might want to make a web application, or we want to use blockchain, that at the end of the day, we're still repeating some typically human process and trying to, you know, make that more efficient.
Do you have an example from a company that you've worked with that you can share about a process you guys were trying to make more efficient, and maybe one that sort of you came in with a certain idea and then ended up changing it based on feedback?
Sure. There was a booth startup that I worked with, and it was, they were collecting reviews for apartment rental, trying to figure out which apartment buildings in Chicago are like the most attractive for, you know, millennials, or just people looking to rent in downtown areas or areas with large, you know, rental supply. And so their initial hypothesis was focused on interviews, and they, you know, built an interview, their initial process was focused on getting reviews from just bunches of different people who lived in those buildings. And so it made a unique data set that was interesting. But then at the end of the day, they weren't really sure how to turn that into a business. So they built a whole MVP around it, you know, and got some traction, and, you know, did that first proof of concept for their business. But by the time I met this entrepreneur, he was transitioning to actually becoming an apartment broker. And so, whereas before he was just engaging with the apartment, you know, or with the buildings and just trying to create these reviews for these buildings, he's like, well, if I'm trying to help people, you know, figure out where to live or which building to live in, well, that's what apartment brokers do. And so he just rolled up his sleeves, got credentialed, went through the licensing process, set up his own brokerage. And now he's running a brokerage that's very technology enabled, and reviews are still a part of it, but he's actually just really innovating in how apartment search is done. And so, you know, that was one booth alum in particular where I just saw that to be the case of, he just kind of grew more and more into the market just by doing that whole process. Originally starting out from that question, where do I want to live? And ending up, you know, into how do I service this person from, you know, they're researching all the way to, you know, helping them to earning a commission for helping them find it.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful way into entrepreneurship, is being a subject matter expert in some field or having prior work experience. For example, as a broker, then you could go on to start a tech company in real estate and really have a lot of industry experience. So for anyone in the audience tonight who has experience like that they're thinking of applying to a startup and maybe feels like it's, I don't know, it's, you know, too small or not scaled up enough or relevant. If it's deep, that can be really powerful. So don't think too small of that. After this workshop, we're going to share a paper that Dylan wrote that is tremendously valuable, I think, in advising on a lot of the topics that we're talking about this evening. One of the things that he talks about in there is becoming the product. And I think this is sort of relevant to our last point, but I would like you, Dylan, to maybe tell a story or give some examples of how people can become the product of the company before they go out and start building a lot of tech that sort of automates those things.
Yeah, I think just when you think about sales, you are the product. Like, you know, there's always risk in working with startups. And so when you're thinking about how do I become the product? You know, you have to see yourself as the initial product. Even if it's a machine learning algorithm, even if it's blockchain, like you're the one who's out there actually selling it on a day-to-day basis, and you're convincing people either to be your customer or to work on it. And so, and on one side, I just, you know, as you pitch your ideas to people and as you know, try to convince them that this is great, or take their feedback and, you know, do customer discovery and just really try to understand their problems, you are just becoming the product because you're looking at it almost as if you were the product. And then, you know, I had a student group this past quarter, and they really wanted to make a new calendar app, you know, and so it was going to be very stylish. And so most of their differentiation was on, you know, just how do I make a calendar app more simple? And that's a tough project to, you know, accomplish in 3 months. But at the end of the day, what I pushed them to do was just engage with some of their friends on campus and just basically be the calendar for them. So have your friends speak to you on a nightly basis or on a weekly basis. And can you tell them, you know, how to organize their calendar? Can you make recommendations of how they should spend their day or how they should spend their free time? Can you debrief with them and learn, you know, were you able to stick to your calendar? Did you run out of time? And just, you know, what originally started out as a technology solution just became them becoming an assistant, you know, to help, you know, people plan their day, react as a, you know, something in a day changes, maybe a meeting comes up or free time opens up. And so they started to like realize that even though I want to build a product, at the end of the day, like I'm still providing a sort of a human service. And so I really encourage you, you know, sometimes in high science, it's really hard to become the product. But, you know, in a lot of use cases and a lot of apps that people are developing, just really try to, you know, solve the solution as you would as a human, and you'll glean good insights from that ultimately will inform the product that you build down the road.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big theme tonight of remembering the human side of all of these things, that we are humans building things. We can't build everything all at once. And then all of our customers and users and team members are also humans and need to be motivated and engaged and need to be really having their needs met. All right, so actually on that human note, when do we bring in other people to this product development process?
Sure, and this one is kind of like, it depends. And, you know, the way I want to couch that is by saying, like, you know, when you're building a new product or, you know, you're a startup, you want to build the right thing. Like that's that elusive goal. Like I still think, you know, companies, even of Amazon's size, they're still trying to build the right thing. Like, you know, they've got a lot of adoption, but at the end of the day, like if they get relaxed, then there's this concern that no longer will they be building the right thing. So it's just as true for large companies as it is for startups. With startups, we have very little, you know, validation. And so it's really easy to kind of get lost in this phase of sort of playing company or playing startup, because when you run a company, you know, you can do payroll, you can set up your accounting software, you might spend 10 days setting up email, you might, you know, try to bring on 10 different consultants or interns who, you know, who might, you know, be able to help your product, and you might just try to grow this team, and it starts to feel like a company. But it's really easy when you don't have a product and you don't have customers to waste a lot of time. And so really, when I think about people at an early stage, you want to think about, are they actually helping me get to the right thing? So some good things to note on people who are helping you get to the right thing. One is they give you good feedback. So, you know, you may come up with an idea and they may give you some brutal, honest truth. And if they're helping you feel like mature as a person, as a product, as a company, keep that person and use that feedback because it's going to make you stronger. If you're just trying to learn the industry, like let's say you're trying to innovate in plumbing, that's a strange example, but let's say online car purchases. Let's say you're trying to do some innovation in online car purchases. You know, if there's somebody who can just teach you about the industry, and maybe it's just you doing weekly calls and just learning from them, like you're trying to ultimately get to things that, you know, help you grow as an entrepreneur, and you don't want to be managing things that aren't going to get you to product market fit or get you to building the right thing more quickly.
I want to jump to a question from the audience real quick. Thoughts about, or actually I'll save these for a minute. Let's see, and then, okay. So continuing off of the right thing to build, customer discovery, could you talk a little bit about building a proof of concept? Maybe, I think this wasn't on my original list of questions, but thinking about where to get started, what goes in the proof of concept versus the initial first version? So proof of concept versus MVP. How do we think about that in the context of de-risking an idea?
Sure. You know, when I think of proof of concept, it's just what is the incarnation of my idea that, you know, somebody will be able to give me feedback on. So that could easily be PowerPoint slides that mimic a screen that's in front of a person. It could be handwritten notes on a piece of paper that shows, oh, you go from here to here. These are the screens that you see. Really, proof of concept is just like, how can I create some structure by which people can give me feedback on the idea? And, you know, as an entrepreneur, like, we're not proud of having long, development cycles. We don't want our MVP to take 6 months. We want it to take 1 month. We want to get feedback on our idea as quickly as possible. And so as much as you can, create it in the fidelity that it's needed to be able to get that feedback, but don't do any more than that, because, I always say at the first step, you're building the wrong thing. Like, it's true in every entrepreneur's journey. You don't just start out and you're building the right thing. And so, you just have to get really comfortable with embracing this feedback cycle and, committing to it and just trying to selfishly get there, and it can be, anywhere from PowerPoint to Excel to handwritten. It's just something that you can show somebody who's either a potential customer or somebody who knows the market that can give you feedback and say, like, I like this, I don't like this, I think you should change this. You want to start that feedback cycle as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I really like the example of your students who were, you basically told them, go give advice to your friends and help them with their calendars. Because if you can't contribute useful things in that context with no technology, what is the technology that you're going to build that's magically going to make you an expert on calendaring? So I think that's great advice. So building off of the next step for that, how do you recommend founders get started if they aren't technical and don't have money to hire coders? How do we sort of move from, if I have something in Excel or piece of paper or a Word document, or I've put something together sort of manually, how do I go about making that a little bit more robust so that people can start to use it?
Yeah, so it's, the biggest issue is just, you probably want to ultimately break your system. And so you've done some, maybe it's handwritten, maybe it's some Excel sheets, but then you start to understand, I can't scale this operation. And so what you've done there is you've shown validation, right? And so one option, and you always have this sort of build it versus buy it, solution when you're thinking about building out technology. And so, if your product is breaking because, there's too much demand or it just can't scale, well, in one sense, what you've shown is validation. And so, and you've already created a process with your Google Sheets or your Excel workbook that, a developer, you can almost hand it to them and say, like, okay, here's what the Excel sheet does. And then it goes to this cell and this is the value that it outputs. And a developer is just very quickly going to want to know what they need to build and try to do that in a more streamlined way. And hopefully, if you're looking at sourcing outside investors, you're also validating, that you have started to, show validation in the marketplace. And so it's kind of an intermediate phase of just, being comfortable and realizing what's breaking and then starting to look at, okay, here's how much it would take and here's to build it out with maybe a dev shop. I might go to them, get a quote, get a sense of that. And if I can't afford that, then I might try to find a technical founder. But if I'm showing validation, a technical co-founder is more likely to work on it with me. And so, you always kind of want to go down both paths in tandem. I do that myself as a developer. Is it worth my time to build this thing out from scratch, or is it better to hand it off to somebody else? And so I do think you should, just as any business goes through that build it versus buy it exercise.
Yeah, and then if we do decide to hire either an individual or an outside firm, what are some factors that people should use to evaluate programmers when they're hiring them?
Yeah, there's, one way, and the risk when you start down this path, especially if you haven't worked with technical people before, is you can really quickly end up in a language, in a land that you don't understand, and you just feel kind of helpless. And so it's easy for, founders to end up with a consulting firm that, the product was supposed to be launched in 3 months, now it's 6 months, and it just keeps adding on because they didn't know I wanted this feature. And so I think that, especially if you're building a technology business, like you can never fully outsource that. Like you can't just be the business founder and then let somebody else manage the tech. Like I think that's a terrible solution, especially if you want to run a technology business. So like the way to, think about this is like, there are experts in the technology realm who like are building tech solutions, and they do YouTube videos on why they made the choices they made. If you read my tech strategy paper that we're going to send out afterwards, I also share the stack that I like to use for a lot of projects. But you'll find developers, you want to find developers that are opinionated and give like motivations for why they're choosing a technology, for your product. And you want them to frame it in terms of your product. Like, okay, so I understand that you're building this apartment search website, so I understand kind of like how often it's going to be used, what times a day, and I also understand the data is going to be unstructured, so I'm going to opt to go with this database. What can be really bad in technical founders or dev shops is they might learn one language and just use it for everything. They'll use the same tool no matter if it's a real-time data platform or a sort of static website. And, you just want to really understand, is this person, one, are they adapting their solution to the needs of my business? And two, you also want to get other data points, speak to 3 to 4 different firms, get a sense of how they talk about it. And then also just watch YouTube videos from, CTOs talking about the choices they've made. I say that like you can look at people's code and to get a sense of whether or not they're good coders. But really when you're thinking about co-founders or partners for that initial phase of the journey, like technical people are making 20,000 choices, right? We got to pick a database, we got to figure out how to host it, we got to figure out, what to do the server side in. There's so many choices that get made that you won't even realize go into a product. And so really you got to get comfortable with, that technical person's decision-making process, and also start to get other data points so that you can, determine whether or not that seems authentic or inauthentic.
And then as far as specific technology itself, you talk about some in your paper, favorite frameworks or packages. Can you talk a little bit about choosing those? Are there super common ones that are always a good decision, or is it really case by case? Or are there certain things to stay away from?
Sure. Yeah, there's kind of like I generally opt for open source where you can get it. I don't think it makes sense to pay for technology right now. There's so many like well-tested open source solutions. So we don't really need like the SQL servers or Oracle databases of the past. For most startups, there's a free solution that we can access that can also scale for our needs. So I think, that's a big consideration is generally I try to stick with open source, but identify technologies that have been well tested. And so it's pretty simple to find, and most of the technology world now is open source. And the other thing I generally do is, aggressively use cloud. This is specific to software as opposed to hardware, but like services like Amazon Web Services, they actually reduce a lot of the work that is needed by your technical team. One of my favorite lines is Instagram had 5 engineers when it got acquired by by Facebook for $1 billion. And so, they had built this massive tech platform and it was servicing, millions of users, and they had 5 engineers. And that's because they were really smart. They aggressively used Amazon Web Services. They didn't have to have a feather in their cap of having an 80-person engineering team and, all these hands on keyboards. They were just really purposeful about, hey, how do we, let Amazon do all this work for us? We'll scale on their platform, and then we just get a focus on the business logic. And that's really what you want to do. And that's true for startups, right? When we're thinking about operations, we want to, just do the things that we need to do, and then try to, the stuff that we don't need to do, hand that off to somebody else. And DevOps is a great example of that. So generally my approach is AWS. It reduces DevOps work, and it allows you to, get security and just take care of a lot of things that if you sort of roll your own software solution, it becomes a mess down the line. And then it also allows you to scale. So Amazon is supporting Netflix, Instagram, all these, incredible platforms that have way more traffic than your idea does right now. And so, just depend on them. And then, scalability is, something I always think about. If you're not a technical founder and you're just trying to get somebody on board, like, you don't want to focus too much on scalability because it is sort of a specialized skill set. The example I gave with Instagram, these were people who had tried other startups and had built on AWS and sort of knew how they wanted to craft this. Sometimes you're going to build your first web application using Ruby on Rails, which is very common in Chicago, for example. And these languages can scale. I don't think they're the best for scalability, but they can also allow you to build an application very quickly. And so I'm not against any technology or any language. It's more about what just helps you get to where you need to get to. But if you are technical, then I am very opinionated, and that's kind of where you'll see in the paper just what I recommend. But generally, it's open source, managed cloud services, and I use JavaScript mostly because I can use it on the client, so on the website, and on the server side.
Yeah, there was a question I'm going to pick up at this point about open source. And using it in a product that goes to market. So how do you navigate the licenses for different open source softwares? And are there certain licenses that you would just recommend staying away from because they would prevent software from becoming proprietary at some point?
Yeah, I can't speak to expertise on that, maybe for machine learning. But generally, at the end of the day, as founders, we're trying to validate an idea as opposed to, let's just do an example. So Facebook has open sourced React, and that's their front-end framework. That's actually the most common web framework right now. And then they also have open source GraphQL, which is a data layer to power a web application. And so, there's some creative licensing in Facebook. So if you use their technology to build a social network, they can pull the technology from that. And that's kind of scary to you as a business. And so there's alternatives out there. So one step is just to look at, are there any viable alternatives? So if you really want to use React, Vue is just as good. But let's say that, React is the only solution. We can remember that at the end of the day, you still want to validate the idea. Most companies have to rewrite code on a regular basis, especially startups. And so, you don't want to sort of over-optimize for this ideal technical stack. And it's not going to be around for 10 years. I'm a seasoned developer, and a lot of the code that I write now, often will end up being rewritten in 1 to 2 years. So I think it's good to be cognizant of it. As far as the special licenses are concerned, I think that's better. Just look at Wikipedia and just kind of read people's guidance on that. But this is still more of an entrepreneur's talk, and so whatever gets you to validation as quickly as possible, I think that's really key.
Yeah, and then I would say for founders looking into specific technologies, do go read the license. And if you're not familiar with it, ask other developers, maybe even consult a lawyer. Just make sure that there's nothing in there that would prevent it if you're going to take that software to market. From basically closed sourcing it, there's a variety of different open source licenses out there. And you want to make sure that it's not going to be a problem for you in the future, because if you were to have to switch frameworks, that could be pretty costly in terms of time and energy and potentially money at some point down the road. So sort of staying on this note, Dylan, of working with developers, what are some things people should know about how developers think, what's important to them to work successfully?
Yeah, I think, where I see projects fall apart is when, especially non-technical founders, start to think of developers as task managers, or just sort of people to do work for them. And especially at an early stage startup, people are going to work on that because they're motivated by the idea, and they're creating this this interesting idea. They're creating this new way of doing things. And, you know, every project that I've ever worked on, and it's, whether it's my own idea or somebody else's idea, there's a time when I'm coding at 3 a.m. and I want to quit. And I'm like, why am I doing this with my life? And I regret my life choice in that moment. And that's just what development is. Like, it's tedious. Like, even if you're like the happiest engineer, like, it's really hard, it's painful. It's like, you know, handling edge cases that are annoying and just, you know, it doesn't seem that productive at all, but you know that you have to do it for the good of the application. And so, like, pulling out like an idea, turning that idea into a product, a fully functional technology product, it's just a labor of love. And so really you got to, you know, encourage developers and also kind of inspire them with that idea, and don't lose sight of that. And an example of this, which I really liked, is there was a time where Steve Jobs was looking at one of the early Apple computers. And there's a, you know, when you start up your computer, there's a sort of a startup sequence. You know, it could take, now they take like, you know, under 5 seconds. Of course, in the 90s and 80s, you know, it was anywhere up to a minute. And it was just the process of the computer starting up. And so I think the Apple developer, for the purpose of this example, had, you know, done the initial startup sequence in a minute. And, you know, he'd stayed up, you know, a whole week trying to get this done, got it done, checked that off his list. And then Steve Jobs was like, oh, could we do it in under 30 seconds? And the guy was frustrated because, you know, he had done this whole week, you know, he got it done, the task is completed. And then Steve Jobs reminded him, you know, if we take, you know, everybody in the world who starts up this computer, the number of times they start up this computer, and then how long it takes, if we can shave off 30 seconds, like, we've given humanity back, you know, thousands and thousands of hours. And, you know, it might seem kind of hokey, but at the end of the day, like, Jobs was able to link it to this idea of like, hey, we're saving people's time. And, you know, we don't want to get into this mindset of just like, oh, the developers are here to do my bidding and check off all my tasks. Like, they still need to be motivated by the idea. And, you know, as a developer, I typically have options, and I can go work at an enterprise, you know, firm and, you know, check off their tasks. Generally, I get to leave at like 5 o'clock and I get paid better. So if I'm going to work on a startup, that idea always has to be sort of front and center. And as a founder, you want to, you know, keep that alive and not just turn it into sort of, you know, checking off tasks.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, and Dylan, tell me what you think about this idea, is include the developers in as many of the conversations with users as you possibly can. This comes up in a big way much later when you have a product built and you're taking support calls and things are broken, which is always a when, not an if, in our human world. But as developers, in my experience, are really smart people. They have opinions. They want to help shape the product. And if you as a founder are uncomfortable with that, recognize that that's an asset there on your team that you could really actually put to work. If you don't trust their judgment, that might be because you know more about the market or your user base than they do. So bring them along and let them be a second or third or fourth set of ears in your user conversations. And, you know, they might have some really valuable feedback on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree, and I would just say sometimes you have to pull it out of them, and to that point. So like, if you are doing meetings, and even if it's a product and you know, they're just supposed to be the engineering team, or they may not feel comfortable over, you know, stepping into that realm because they see you as the business person. Just know as a founder, you know, as a leader of your team, you might have to pull out feedback. They may have a lot of feedback to share. They may, you know, tell their significant other about it when they're back at the house or, you know, just with their friends, but they may not feel comfortable telling that to you because you haven't set that convention of, hey, your voice matters. And so, you know, don't just assume that because a developer is quiet that they don't care about the idea or they don't want it to be successful. Sometimes you just have to pull it out of them. You know, many, you know, can be introverted, just like myself. And so it's always good just to check in with them and just pull it out. You know, you don't want to force it, but oftentimes there is something there. But you know, that's just your job as a leader.
Yeah, I think that's a really great and really important point. If someone wants to start working on the product themselves, what are some ways to do that? Either using different pieces of technology like Excel or Tableau, or actually learning how to code? What are some recommendations you have or resources for getting started like that?
Yeah, I think, a good place is just to start with what you know. So if you do know Excel or you're proud of PowerPoint, like there's a lot of things you can do in PowerPoint. I made a whole Algebra 2 curriculum in PowerPoint when I was a teacher on the west side of Chicago. And so there's, technology is pretty sophisticated and it can get us pretty far. Of course, with like Wix and Squarespace, and there's just, a lot of technology that's built for non-technical people. And so first step is to go with what you know. If you don't feel like that's good enough, then research of something that, allows you to accomplish it, on your own, or at least, kind of without you actually having to write the code. If you're just trying to get something that's, functional and can accomplish what you want it to do. If you're trying to learn how to code, one of the risks is there's a lot of different types of code and there's a lot of different, programming languages. And so, one mistake I see people make is, especially if they're trying to create a product, is they're like, oh, I know that I want to build an app, so I'm going to learn Python, because everyone says like Python is a really common coding language. And so then they'll buy like an idiot's guide to Python, and then they'll start to work through the examples. But because it's not relevant to like a use case for them, they start to tire out on it. It's like a very difficult way to learn anything, is just to like have it totally divorced from something that you're passionate about. So even if like you've never coded before, but if you know that you want to build an app, like just start with that. Learn how to, and you just want to do iOS to start off with, just start to learn that iOS process. Like really it's key to set your domain. And just say like, okay, I'm going to learn how to do an app, so I'm going to do what's called a Hello World iOS app. So generally the first incarnation of a project, sort of that first project in any language is called the Hello World app. And so you're going to learn, how do I do a Hello World app in iOS or Xcode or on Android. And so that's kind of the most basic place to start. And then if you want to get better at coding and build up your technical chops, there's things like Code Wars, where you can then start to kind of learn like, how do I do things more efficiently? So you basically get a problem, you try to solve it in like 15 minutes, and then you get a look at how more experienced coders solve that problem in a more efficient manner. So like, if you want to like start to build up your muscles of coding, that it's a great way just to like learn syntax and become a much more efficient coder. But generally, pick your domain, do that Hello World app, and then just start, working on additional examples in that domain.
Yeah, I think that's really, really great advice. Start with what you know. Start with a project that you automatically feel sort of motivated to work on, because learning to code and coding is always a frustrating thing, but it's rewarding. Someone asked a really great question that I think is really relevant to this discussion of how to get started quickly, which is really important. What are some favorite prototyping platforms that you have? And what are your thoughts on using things like that for demos and pitches? I absolutely love this question, and I would add to that use case, even you doing real customer research.
Yeah, we've used Balsamiq, mockups, and I know there's some more that are out there now. I think like Sketch, you can do prototypes now. So there's a lot of solutions. Generally, my co-founder and I, we actually just do HTML and CSS. So, because we can code, we sort of have an advantage of just being able to do like some basic prototyping in HTML and CSS. So when we demo to like clients or, somebody who's thinking about the product, it can feel like a real website out of the gate. But at the end of the day, we're kind of prototyping. So there's probably some services that I haven't interacted with as much, just because I lean a little bit more technical. But we have also definitely done things in like PowerPoint and, on pieces of paper, Balsamiq, mockups. The solutions are out there. They're generally free to access, and it might take a couple of days to feel comfortable with, but you can put together a prototype, pretty quickly.
And then I'll take another question here from the audience and encourage everyone else to chime in with these too. Dylan, thoughts on project management tools? When are they necessary? Is Notion the best one? Notion is awesome. I don't know if it's the best one or if there is the best one. But what are some thoughts on project management tools? Yeah, I'll toss that to you.
Yeah, I still, there's a lot of overhead that you can get into with project management. And so it's really just finding what makes you productive as a person. And it's kind of a cheap answer on my part, but you know, for me, a lot of times it's still like just piece of paper and a to-do list because it's in front of me all the time. And I find that I just need that commitment, you know, to be right next to me to see it. I've worked with Trello. I've done things like pull requests on GitHub, you know, tried a lot of different approaches. But I think it's really just sort of what helps your team and you stay like in sync and then holds you accountable. And I think like, you know, it's kind of like a really fun maze of, you know, you can get into any project management tool and it can either help you or hurt you. At the end of the day, it's kind of a tool, but like, no matter what you choose, you just want to step back and be like, is my team happy with it? Like, are they happy with Trello? Am I abusing Trello and they're feeling like inundated with requests? Like, you know, am I using a Google Sheet and now the Google Sheet has like 180 rows of feature requests and now the developers are overwhelmed? I think it's less, you know, about, you know, there's some features, of course, but also just about, is this increasing productivity? And that's kind of my guidance. Like, find what works for you, but just make sure that it's working strongly for the team and, you know, you feel like you guys are, you know, more productive with it than without it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I bet you too, Dylan, have seen sort of like the term you used earlier, play startup, in setting up Notion. It's really fun. It's really fun to put emojis all over the place, and I'm all for it. But it's not actually helping your company move forward. And so I think sort of, I would say like the minimum that is actually helping you move forward. And when that minimal thing stops working and you really need more, then move up. But I would say do so quickly, and don't let that be a thing in the way of making progress.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I mean, I've seen startups with Slack channels that are just crazy. Like, but then I've seen startups that manage Slack channels so well. And so it's just kind of, it ties into your culture. I also believe like in a culture where people feel comfortable calling each other. One service I really like is Whereby. It's like a really low, simple way to just do like screen sharing and video conference, and you just go to a link. You can do calls on Slack now, but generally I just feel like, you know, a whole point of a team is sometimes we end up typing more than, you know, than it's necessary, and we could just kind of resolve it with a call. And I think, you know, I see that in myself, you know, having grown up with technology versus, you know, my parents are always more, you know, comfortable making calls and just getting in touch with people. And I think that's probably even more true of the younger generation. And so, you know, just, you know, be comfortable just sort of breaking down like ways to communicate and, you know, just go direct to the source if you need to, even if that's, you know, voice. Yep,
sometimes it's the phone. Surprise, surprise. We sort of a big question here that I know we both have opinions on. This one asks about protecting ideas, products, code. Software patents is sort of meaty issue. Will you sign an NDA before you talk to me? Things like that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. One time so generally I don't sign NDAs for products. And, you know, I think everyone's a little worried about Mark Zuckerberg problem. I think if you watch the Social Network movie, you become just very scared of becoming the Winklevoss twins. And I mean, that's a healthy scare. But you know, at the end of the day, I think, you know, Mark Zuckerberg ultimately went and built the product, and you know, they had to resolve all of that. Generally, I don't want to work on your idea. Like, it's really, really painful just to be like, oh, this guy has this idea for advertising, way to make social media advertising more exciting. I'm a technical person, so I'm just going to steal that and then like make social media advertising really efficient. So this actually happened to me, and the guy, like, I had sat in with a meeting with him. He walked me through the idea. I followed up with like encouragement and said, like, I think it's a great idea and here's some things to think about. And then he messaged back and said, you aren't going to steal my idea, are you? And it was just because I had shown interest and been supportive. And it's like, there's no way I want to work on a social media idea. I have 18 ideas of my own, and I'm definitely not a domain expert. And so just as a technical person, you know, there are legitimate concerns of like IP theft, especially as you get into like, you know, technical issues. Like, you can look at the autonomous vehicle technology lawsuits between like Uber and Google, I think. Like, those are some, you know, great instances where people start to be really concerned about that stuff, but often it's at big companies. I don't have an incentive to build your idea because it's really, really, really painful to try to build something from scratch and bring it to life. So why would I do that instead of getting paid like, you know, good money to like work at a Google or something? It's just, when it comes to dealing with me, I'm just not going to steal your idea.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about copyright, and maybe you do. My understanding is that code is automatically copyrighted when you write it, and generally that's how copyright works in the United States, is this just by writing a novel or a paper, I own the copyright to that. If I know for music or a book or something like that, if I want the government to have a record that I have created a piece of work, then I have to file it with the government, with the USPTO. Do you know, is there anything you can share on code copyright or things like that?
Yeah, you can copyright code. I do know that. I think you almost have to exactly follow like the way that, you know, at the end of the day, code filters down to like memory blocks and basic stuff like that. So it's, you know, the sequence of the code. And so, you know, I just generally, you know, most products, they need users for them to be valuable. And so I think sometimes just because it's, you know, very rarely is your value going to come from the tech you built. If it is coming from the tech you built, then you must be like the expert in your field and the, you know, one woman or man who knows how to do that, or, you know, top 5. Generally, most of us, our value is going to come from building products that are, you know, that are used, that have customers, and that's why like a VC is going to be interested, or a potential acquirer. If you are in high science though, like definitely talk to like a tech transfer office at your firm. That's definitely a question more for them if you are kind of like, you know, at the cutting edge and pushing the boundaries of expertise. You know, there's typically your organization or your university has resources for you.
Yep, I totally agree. My general advice to founders is, in almost all cases, ideas are cheap. Execution is really hard. Humans are really lazy. And development is really hard and painful, like you've said, and time consuming. But if you do really think you have something that should be patented, be careful with it and go talk to someone. If you're at the university, that'd be the tech transfer office. You can reach them at polsky.uchicago.edu or shoot me an email and I can help with that. I'd like to take another question from the audience at this point, asking about your take on cross-platform languages like React Native and Flutter. He says it looks like Flutter is up and coming and considered better from performance standpoint. How important is the decision between these two at the beginning of a startup?
If you're just trying to get cross-platform, like I typically look at like, so React Native versus Flutter, like, so they're helping you build either on iOS or Android, just for context for people. And so, you know, both are viable solutions. Flutter, and you'll see this a lot in tech where somebody's like, you know, our performance is stronger than the existing, you know, more commonly used tool. And so generally I don't find that it like makes or breaks your idea. Like, and this happens to me as a technical person. When I'm sort of making those technology choices, I can spend like 2 to 3 days, like, and I've done this previously. I was looking at React Native versus Flutter, basically to your question. And where I came on that specific issue was like, okay, I think React Native like is still, you know, going to be around, and I think it has a lot of support. And I don't think the performance benefits are that meaningful in Flutter to like make a huge difference for the product I'm building. You know, some people might say, well, if you're really trying to achieve the most performance, then you should just build a native app for iOS and a native app for Android. And so, you know, Flutter is getting you closer to that sort of, you know, ideal state of writing cross-platform and getting the most performance. But it's just, you know, ultimately you just want to pick a solution where you can, one, find talent. So sometimes when you pick like really cutting edge technologies like Flutter, or at least more recently cutting edge technology, your developer base might just go down, right? So then, you know, it becomes harder to actually find somebody who can do that. Whereas if you go with React Native, which has been around a little bit longer, then you just have a wider developer base. And so kind of when you look at technology decisions, it's like sometimes like you can over optimize for performance, but then like kill your talent pool. And generally, like I think most startups, you just want to have a rich talent pool. Like you don't want to get siloed into like an obscure programming language where now you can't find help, you know, just because you know, developers can be transient. You want to be able to grow your team more quickly. And so one resource I'd strongly recommend is you can actually look at Stack Overflow, which is a great Q&A website for anything technology related, even down to specific coding issues. And they actually do an annual survey of developer happiness. And so you can see like which programming languages developers actually like to write code in. And generally, if you build on those technologies, then you're going to have happy developers, right? And so I really encourage people to like look at that kind of stuff, because when you really technology decisions, often in some ways they're about scalability and performance, but really more it's about who's going to like bring this technology to life. And you want your developers to be happy and be comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You know, in addition to something you said much earlier in this conversation about things that are using technologies that have been around long enough to really be tested and robust, finding things that you can actually find developers for is really critical. There's no points in this game for being clever and using Haskell for, you know, an iOS app, if that's even possible. There's a related question next about Bubble. Which, if folks aren't familiar, is they call it an application development language, but it's really a sort of user interface to make fairly you can use it to make fairly complicated software without actually programming.
I haven't actually used you know, as a coder, I actually haven't used the software like that. Again, it just kind of comes down to the point of almost what we spoke about with like Flutter versus React Native. It's just kind of like, will this get me to where I need to be? The great thing about technology is that there are a lot of options, and you know, two CTOs, one can pick React Native, one can pick Flutter, you know, there's just you just want to figure out like what, you know, maybe you only have a Flutter developer right now, and so you're like, okay, I'm just going to go with it because at the end of the day I need to get started. And so generally those decisions are okay. With stuff that, you know, prevents you from coding, like generally my thought is it's not going to like be your long-term solution. So at least like understand that. So like you may not have to code, but like eventually you generally need to code unless it's, you know, a very generic standardized process. But like, so you know, you can like adopt that for now and be like, oh, that's my 1-year solution. But generally, like if you're going to build a whole technology company around this, eventually you're going to have to figure out like how to get off of this. And so, you know, one situation where I see this sometimes is like with Firebase, which is a database provided by Google. It's really useful. Like you can build an app and it sort of is like this database as a service. So you don't have to think through the schema as much, and like you can just very quickly, whether it's an iOS app or a web application, push information to a database, and it's kind of streamlined. You didn't have to set up the database. But I've also seen apps that need to get out of Firebase eventually, because it's like not easy to pull your data out of Firebase. So like now if you want to start like building machine learning models on top of it, or like, you know, use those insights and try to like run queries, then you want to bring your you know, your database kind of back into your own world. But what Firebase allows you to do is, you know, build a prototype, build a proof of concept and get it running. And so I don't think there's any shame in that. And I think like just pick whatever gets you to productivity and customer feedback as quickly as possible. But if you do pick those solutions, know that like, it's probably not like, you're not going to like sell your company in 10 years and still be running on that solution.
I think that's probably true, yeah. And it's always a hard call of when is it time to move off to some other robust thing, and when is it, you know, when is it worth it to do something more simple, to get started quickly. And with all of these decisions and you know, people thinking about which software to use, which framework to use, which tools to use for project management, there really is no best answer. It's always up to you and the team, and founders should always remember that you are the expert on your company, and it's your job to sort of edit and parse all the feedback you get from the world and from Dylan and from me, and make a decision and be wrong and learn from it, and that's fine. If people are interested in playing with Bubble, there is a discount for Polsky members. I'll drop my email in here and you're welcome to reach out. If you're not a member, you can sign up and get access to that. I think it could be a great way to start, but you know, it might not be a forever thing. There's another question I wanted to talk about how to find a technical co-founder. I think this is, you know, really hard. This is sort of like asking, how do you find a spouse? But what is your take on this question?
Well, yeah, I think, yeah, we do have solutions or ways people go about trying to find a spouse, for example. And so, there's speed dating, there's online dating now, people are trying to solve this problem. And I think a lot of the rules kind of apply to finding the technical co-founder. Like, if you really are trying to find that person, like, you don't want to just meet one technical person and have them become your co-founder, right? Like, there's a distribution of technical people and, from the most extroverted to the most introverted. And, you want to start to build your idea of what does that distribution look like and who seems to be a good fit for me. And so, just as when you're thinking about dating and, how do I, meet more people or just have more opportunities to interact with people, when you're thinking about technical people, like, you don't want to just put out a job posting and hope somebody responds and like, that has those exact skills. You actually want to get to know them. And you also want to know other technical people to validate whether or not, they seem, like credible and intelligent and able to do, what I think is important for this project. So I just really encourage you, just as you're doing customer discovery interviews, like just try to get comfortable with technical people, start to go to events like hackathons. And like, even if you can't like code right alongside them, like just spend the evening with them while they're doing it and asking them questions. Just learn more about like who they are. And yeah, you are like, I say entrepreneurship is like outside of marriage, probably one of the most spiritual journeys you can make with somebody. And so you really want to be aligned with that co-founder. And if you truly are looking for a co-founder, then you got to roll up your sleeves and do research and, just try to meet as many people as you can and feel good about that decision. Otherwise, if you're not able to find that, start to look, for outsourced or, temporary people to kind of get you over the curve. But a co-founder is like a real investment. So you should definitely feel good about them as people and trust their advice and, respect their judgment.
Yep, I like to think of co-founders as people who sort of carry the emotional burden of the startup as well. They're also up late at night, worrying about things, working on stuff, sleep deprived. They're people that you have big arguments with sometimes. You make up, you go back to work. It's a heavy relationship, and I really like what you said about treating it like dating in that you go and get other people's opinions of them. I think that that's a thing that we know about for dating. You want your friend's opinion. At some point you maybe do, or maybe you don't want your parents' opinion. But in this case, you really do want the opinion of other technical people to look at their work and evaluate it and help you get some more outside opinions on not just one person, but a number of people. We are about at 8 o'clock. I have one more question from the audience. These have been great questions. If anyone else has a question, feel free to send it over. And I will drop my email in right now so you have that, or actually you'll all have it afterwards, just in case. There you go. And then you'll have it also afterwards. You're welcome to reply when I send out Dylan's paper. So one last question for now is book recommendations for someone looking to better understand end-to-end architecture, either for databases, server architecture, and this is someone who's not technical, but would like to increase their understanding so that they can help evaluate vendors and work with developers.
That's interesting. I think books can get, a lot of technical books are kind of how, deep dives into technology. And they'll, if you pick up a book on databases, you're going to learn about it's sort of how do you make that database atomic and what's underneath powering that, ability to make sure transactions don't infringe on each other. And there's kind of like, you can very quickly get into this like deep dive of like, what are we getting here? And I think like, typically you want to be actually more at like a sort of like the way Amazon Web Services sort of pitches, their products, they're often like gearing it towards like a non-technical or somebody who has to make technology decisions, but isn't, coding on a day-to-day basis or understands like the whole history of like, where JavaScript started to where it is now. And I think that like, I can't like, I don't have a book off the top of my head just to answer your question, but I would really just watch like YouTube videos from like product managers for different services. So like let's say you're looking at MongoDB versus like PostgreSQL for your database, just go to like kind of a product manager. These groups are typically trying to sell their technology and they are focusing on that. And so I would just watch these different talks that are geared towards you and just start to learn that language. And then, you know, a great exercise is just to, you know, what I always do is I'll search MongoDB versus Postgres. And even though I know what those technologies are, I know how they're different, like you can just ultimately read these conversations. If you have ever gone to the website, of course, I mentioned Stack Overflow, Hacker News, it's kind of like the elitist developers like pontificating on why they like this technology and not that technology. Just like read these discussions and you start to really understand the trade-offs. And somebody might say like, this technology was really great when we had 10,000 customers, but then once we hit like 1 million customers, you know, we had to say goodbye to it. And then you start to understand, okay, that's what the trade-offs are here. Like whether or not I like run my own database or I use something in the Amazon Web Services. So just use the Google blank versus blank. That's a great way to just start to learn like why these different technologies are useful. And then I just try to watch, you know, if you are looking at vendors, I would just watch their presentations, which I can generally find on YouTube.
I think that's great advice. I think hearing it right from people is super helpful. And so the only thing I would add to that is, you know, anytime you have an opportunity to sit down and talk with someone about a project they've worked on, do that and have them, you know, just keep asking why, and then why did you do that, and why did you do this, and why was it like that, and then what happened, and what happened, and you can sort of, you know, go through as much detail as you're willing to get out of them. And my experience with either technical developers or scientists sometimes is they aren't used to people being so interested in all of the details. And so they sometimes tend to give you fairly simple answers at first because, you know, most people don't want the complicated answer. And if you really do, you might have to ask a few times. But they're usually appreciative that someone actually wants to get into the nitty-gritty of what they're working on. And I think hearing, you know, those true stories from people about technology can be really helpful.
Yeah, and you always have to remember that there's like 40 different ways to build a solution. And so just be aware that, like, you know, you can kind of get into this, well, how do I pick the perfect choice? And at the end of the day, like, you know, my instincts as a developer might be very different from somebody else's instincts, but we can both build a solution that, like, is as performant and as robust. And we used entirely different, you know, technology layers to do it. Like some people love Azure, some people love Amazon Web Services. It's rare that I'm doing something that's like so crazy and uniquely to my project that it couldn't be done somewhere else. It's just that, you know, you want your developers to be happy, whoever's doing the building. And so whatever creates that productivity, like know that they're never choosing like the most optimal and perfect solution. Like that should never be like, and I think for like, a lot of us entrepreneurs, like we want to get things right. We want it to be the best thing possible. And like, we want to make sure it's even empirical and based on research and just like the best. But no, like when you're building a product, like it's messy, it's going to be tough to bring into conception. And so like every time you pick a technology, like there's a chance that a year later, like some new technology is going to come and it would have been way better to build your app on that. And that's just like the reality of this, you know, choosing to build a technology product. So, you know, try to make a good decision and just like understand that like you'll never make the right choice 100% of the time. And there's also 1,000 different ways to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And that'll kind of keep your head focused on like, how do we make a productive decision that helps us move forward as a company while still, you know, being concerned about can this scale and perform?
Yeah, I think going back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, you know, really having in mind the clear goal for the stage that you're at of what is like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 things that you need to figure out right now, approve right now, de-risk, questions that you need to answer about your market. And I would sort of somewhat evaluate different technologies or even team members sometimes based on the stage that you're at, understanding that, you know, as they say, what got you here won't get you to the next place. And in a sense, everything is temporary. And when you find perfect, please let me know and share it with me. But until then, you know, there is no such thing. And so it's more about just moving forward and learning as you go. Dylan, you've been fantastic tonight. I don't have more questions from the audience, so I just want to ask if there's any final words you'd like to share.
Well, since a lot of you guys are entrepreneurs, I just want to add, you know, as one myself, and I know Steph is as well, and that's really what's helped us bond. Just hearing how she, you know, started something out of college, like, you know, I have so much respect for each of you taking this journey and trying to do something that's unknown and terrifying, especially when you don't know, what the reward's going to be. And just know that, even though that's really tough, like it's a really great experience. And I think overall it always makes you a better rounded, more well-rounded person, because you've had to hustle, you've had to sell, you've had to build, you've had to make decisions without resources and, operate, to be as efficient in highly constrained environments. And so I just have a really strong love for entrepreneurs and, really appreciate you guys making time and, trying to take this journey of uncertainty. But, I hope that you all find it's worth it and enjoy it as much as I do.
Awesome. With that, we're going to wrap up. I will send everyone out the paper and the recording after Zoom is finished processing it for this. Dylan, thank you a million for taking the time tonight to talk to your webcam and all of us about this. It's a strange time and a hard thing to do. And your expertise here is really valuable. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you. And thanks for all your insight as well. Just value your input as much as mine.
That's super great. All right, we will see everyone later. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Bye.